Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagement. And today we're going to the 2020 article by Asad Haider, Pessimism of the Will, because that's the kind of mood I'm in. All right. This is from Viewpoint Magazine back when they were still doing stuff. Like I said, they seem to have not been updating their website since 2023. We start off with a clip from a colorized version of a newspaper from the Fiat plant in Torino, Turin, in 1920. It's a page from a 1945 Communist Party pamphlet with the caption, "The Red Guards of Fiat greet Gramsci," image provided by Paul Saba. During the period where Gramsci was, kind of recast as a major figure in the continuity of the Communist Party of Italy, which was really a different Communist Party that was reformed in the 1940s from the one that existed with Borga and Gramsci and Tagliati and a bunch of other people in the 1920s. But anyway, in teens. In April 1920, Italy was in crisis. The previous month at the Fiat Auto factory in Turin, management had set back the clock hands of the factory for daylight savings time without asking permission from the democratic workers' councils that had been spreading throughout Italy's factories. A chain of work stoppages had popped off in protest, but tense negotiations continued with massive lockout by management because it became clear that what was really at stake was the existence of the factory councils themselves. The whole city entered into a general strike in defense of the councils, which Antonio Gramsci would hail later that year in a report for the Comintern as a great event, not only in the history of the Italian working class, but also in the history of the European and world proletariat, because for the first time, the proletariat was seen to take up the fight for control of production without being forced into the struggle by unemployment and hunger. Which is just a good point. This was a peak moment in Italy's Biennio Rosso, the two red years of 1919-1920, which saw not only mass strikes, but also the occupation of factories by workers' councils, which experimented with self-management of production. The rising during the red years, L'Ordine Nouveau, the New Order, both a newspaper and a political tendency which Gramsci helped found in Turin within the Italian Socialist Party, reflected on the greater meaning of these struggles. In the pages of L'Ordine Nouveau, Gramsci introduced a phrase that he would repeat throughout his life: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Which, by the way, it's actually quite interesting. I always thought Gramsci invented that too, but he didn't. The phrase, which appears in published translation, pessimism of the intelligence, is more precise, but the slogan had widely circulated with the word intellect producing a perhaps more malevolent sentences. I have simply used them interchangeably. But Gramsci didn't come up with that phrase, actually. It seems to have different origins than just Gramsci. In fact, the line, at least according to Adam Tooze, was taken from a Romain Rolland review of Raymond Lefebvre's novel, The Sacrifice of Abraham. So it was something that Gramsci picked up on from the popular press and used himself, which I find interesting. L'Ordine Nouveau tendency based itself on the model of the Russian Revolution and saw factory councils, which Gramsci understood to be equivalent of the Russian Soviets, as the foundation of the coming revolution and the worker state with which the revolution was established. This was back before it was clear that the Bolsheviks and the councilists were not always on the same side. This is pretty early on. And some of the debates between Gramsci and Borga would be based around Gramsci's initial taking of the Soviets at face value. After the bureaucracies of the Socialist Party and its affiliated union, the General Confederation of Labor, obstructed the further development of the general strike in favor of the revolutionary direction, a contradiction which would resurge around the factory occupations in the fall, Gramsci's tendencies, along with other elements to the left of the party, split off to found the Communist Party of Italy in 1921. he joined with Bordiga, who was Gramsci was the first general secretary of the party, from what I can tell, but Bordiga was really the leader and founder of the party until he was sidelined in the late 1920s. In reaction to the upheaval of these struggles and their emancipatory possibilities, fascist violence intensified, leading to the ascendancy of Benito Mussolini, who himself had come out of the maximalist faction of the Socialist Party of Italy, which needs to be remembered. During World War I, the Italian party had bucked the trend of the European parties, but had also not sided with the Russians, the Serbians, or the Americans. Yeah, U.S. was actually on the right side of something for once, and not supporting World War I. The Italian Socialist Party declared neutrality, so the maximalist factions that were in favor of it, and the factions that weren't, could stay in alliance and together in the party. They took the position similar to the position that Kautsky himself tried to take but lost the vote on, and the German party. Anyway, Kautsky did not declare neutrality, did not vote for or against the war credits, and then recorded the unanimous decision, so it looked unanimous for the future. Anyway, the fascist regime outlawed the Communist Party, and in 1926, Gramsci was in prison. He would die in prison in 1937. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will has become one of the classic cliches of politics. It's supposed to suggest that one should have clear-eyed recognition of how bad things are without losing hope. It means a conscious volition for changing the world nonetheless. Nevertheless, it might be wise to be somewhat suspicious of a slogan which seems so reassuring, applicable to every context without modification. That it is a tribute to Gramsci does not really help matters. Yep. Due to perhaps the difficulty and complexity of Gramsci's writing, which are often attributed to the need to write esoterically under the rostral eye of the fascist prison censor, the prison notebooks are notoriously opaque and not fully translated in English even to this day, contemporary commentators have sometimes appropriated the term in a vague and decontextualized manner. It is common to see Gramsci invoked as the advocate of gradualist programs of reform, non-reformist reformism, and all that crap, with the language of war position, or to see him turn into a cultural critic who advocated counter-hegemony in the academy, and not the party, which is what he was actually trying to do. His ardent enthusiasm for insurrection of the Workers' Council seems to drop out of the picture. These days, we need to cheer ourselves up, but without pretending that the coronavirus and climate change aren't real. As fiat workers today go on strike over the safety risk of the coronavirus, compelling management to shut down the plants in Italy and North America, what better authority than Gramsci, martyred by fascism and riding between two devastating world wars, to lend his approval to our desperate bid for optimism? Desperate indeed, as the optimists were wrong again. Removed from the very specific context in which he initially wrote these words, however, and the very different context in which they would later be repeat them, his motto resembles nothing more than a poster on the wall of middle school classroom. Ouch. I like when Haider writes like this, though. It's way better than when he tries to write in scientific structural forms that often aren't very clear. Party. The line is originally not Gramsci's. Thank you. He drew it from the French left-wing writer Romain Rolland, who would later campaign for Gramsci's release from prison, in a 1920 review of Raymond Lefebvre's novel The Sacrifice of Abraham. Good point. Gramsci first used the phrase in his Address to the Anarchist, published in L'Ordre des Nouveaux in April 1920, just as the situation in turn was accelerating towards a general strike. And remember, the anarchists in this case were syndicalists, I believe. It must be noted that from the outset, the anarchists played an absolutely fundamental role in the organization of the strikes and the councils, and have produced some of the movement's most effective and dedicated militants. In making his case for the superiority of Marxist theory, then, Gramsci had to bend the stick rather far. Anarchism, he argued, in abstract opposition to the state, failed to grasp that true freedom for the workers would only come from the establishment of a workers' state, a dictatorship of the proletariat, the determinate form of human action, which had been demonstrated and guaranteed by the Russian Revolution. He introduced the slogan "Pessimism of the Intellect, opposition of optimism of the will," specifically to sum up the socialist conception of the revolutionary process. According to the anarchists, Marx's pessimism of the intellect saw the conditions of the workers as so miserable, the only possible change would come through an authoritarian dictatorship. But Gramsci replied that socialist pessimism had been confirmed by the horrors of the First World War and the extreme poverty and oppression that followed. The proletariat was geographically dispersed and disempowered by its deprivation and formed unions and cooperatives out of sheer necessity, not as free political action. Its activity was totally determined by the capitalist mode of production and the capitalist state. And it was thus purely an illusion, he concluded, to expect that these oppressed and subjugated masses to express their own autonomous historical will. Now, that's actually not a particularly great reading of Marx, but it is what Gramsci thought and what most communists thought. In other words, the pessimism of the intellect demonstrated not just that the situation was bad, but that the basis for revolutionary action did not already exist. That's important. It could not be brought about only by a highly organized and disciplined party that could act as a spur to revolutionary creativity. The optimism of the will, then, was not merely a belief that it was possible that things could be better, but the very specific and concrete form of action, which was a vanguard party in its mission of establishing the workers' state. Fair enough. Gramsci, in other words, was operating squarely within the Leninist problematic, as was almost all of the Italian communists, including the left faction, but not the syndicalist. We are past the point today of the forced choice between caricaturing the problematic or dogmatically asserting its supremacy. Rather, we can try to situate it historically and understand its validity and limits. As Christine Bucky Gluckman writes in her classic study, Gramsci and the State, emphasizing the character of Gramsci thought as a continuation of Leninism in a different historical conditions and with different historical circumstances. The difference in historical conditions and circumstances being part of the debate with Bordiga. That's me adding that. Quote, to continue Lenin means a productive and creative relationship that could never be exhausted in the mere application of Leninism by studious pupils, but involves its translation and development. The nuance is of capital importance, underlining the fact that only orthodoxy is permissible as that of the revolution. In the 1902, with What Is to Be Done, V.I. Lenin repeated, for Russian conditions, the orthodoxy of the German Social Democratic Party. Largely, I think, illustrates that pretty well, honestly. According to this orthodoxy, left to their own devices, workers would only engage in immediate everyday struggles to better their conditions. They would be struggling in the sociological sense and for immediate returns, what we often call trade union consciousness, right? The consciousness that this class struggle had taken further to the level of conquest of political power would have to be introduced from the outside by intellectuals. Now, Marx doesn't say that. Marx actually says it has to be introduced by the advanced parts of the proletariat, but he doesn't really tell you what that means. Is that intellectuals? Is that intellectua? I mean, because the intellectua are intellectuals who make, who are not wage earners and are largely dependent on other institutions or the state or patronage. Politics would not come from spontaneous action by the workers, but from the organization of the vanguard party of revolutionaries. That is, by the way, the SPD model doesn't get invented by the Bolsheviks. Lenin's articulation of this thesis was divisive, to say the least. The orthodox theory saw the processes happening by the virtue of historical laws, drawing more and more people into the industrial working class, gathering them into unions, and eventually allowing them to achieve a majority in parliament. This was the Second International Understanding of what the Vanguard Party was supposed to do. Also, this is where the economistic debates come in, because they kept seeing that the industrial working class never became the majority of the population, and they couldn't figure out what to do with the other laboring classes. Lenin's writing from What Is to Be Done to State and Revolution in 1917 show him formulating a conception of politics which could not be reduced to historical laws. Lenin advanced the thesis that politics is not just always there, but develops under specific conditions. Gramsci said in his early voluntarist text, The Revolution Against Capital, that's capital, not capitalism, that's a revolution against Marx. This continuation, a refutation of the reigning mechanistic interpretation of Marxism, which has been contaminated by positivist and naturalist incrustations, insisted that, quote, events should follow a predetermined course, which ironically was later picked up by later Bolsheviks themselves. funnily enough. The Bolshevik Revolution, Gramsci argued, demonstrated the necessity of active agents of politics, quote, to ensure the event should not stagnate, that drive the future should not come to a halt. The first Leninist condition of politics was the Vanguard Party, a group of dedicated militants which would erase the distinction between intellectuals and workers in the collective leadership. The party would be capable of recognizing the revolutionary potential of spontaneous movements and could bring them the socialist consciousness, which would realize its potential, translating them from the class in themselves to the class for themselves in classical Marxist terminology. That's me adding that, but that's what's implied here. But by 1917, Lenin had came to see the party as assisting alongside another side of politics, the Soviets. It was debated a lot whether or not the Soviets were cynical by Lenin or not even just by critics of Lenin or, people who thought they were on Lenin's side and then later realized they weren't, like the Council Communist of the Netherlands and parts of Germany, but also by Bordiga and people who thought that the Soviets were too democratic and whatnot. Anticipating Gramsci's account of the political role of knowledge, we can say that this side of politics went beyond the restricted intelligence of the militants who composed the vanguard apology to the mass intelligence of the radically democratic councils, the Soviets. The Orthodox theory had sought to enter the parliamentary state and use it as an instrument for the interests of the working class, although asterisk, in classical Marxism, at least from Marx, it was only ever supposed to do so in the negative unless it could take over the entire state. Marx is actually really clear about that. The SPD and the Second International were not, but it's clear from the letters that's what he meant. He gets really mad anytime anyone tries to form a government with a bourgeois power, even if they're a relatively leftist one, and he threatens to leave as a foreign representation almost every time it happens. He's always writing mean levels to Bible and Leninism over this. The Orthodox theory had sought to enter the parliamentary state and use it as an instrument for the interests of the working class. And Lenin's vision, the Soviets would actually take the place of the previous existing state, allowing ordinary people to participate in the administration of society. The Soviet would be a form of genuine self-government, a higher form of democracy than the previous existing form of parliamentary democracy, which also should naturally appease the syndicalist. Now, I could get into the difference between syndicalist and communist and council communists, because a lot of anarchists don't actually seem to understand the difference, and there's some big ones, but we'll come back there. What happened instead is that the centralized authority of the party became the state and subordinated the mass intelligence of the Soviets to the principle that only the party thinks. Bordiga believed that and called the party the brain of society. That's what Bordiga used to say. Lenin, in the paradoxical position of state revolutionary, called for a society in which every cook can govern, to adopt C.L. James's optimistic reading of Lenin's phrase, but in practice it was the party state which reigned. Now, this is interesting coming from somebody who's a Mao sympathizer like Haider. For the remainder of the 20th century, emancipatory politics would refer to the exemplary instance in which the bourgeois political power was converted by the party to becoming the state. Leninism was a moment in the history of the emancipatory politics, but over the course of history, it found itself running up against the limits of the party state, and we are still in search of emancipatory politics which go beyond the party state, and we have basically given up on that in 2024, apparently. But anyway, today's Gramsci's model is widely repeated, but it appears to have become completely detached from the underlying strategic and organizational questions that framed Gramsci's use of the phrase in L'Ordre Nouveau, where it was repeated a few times with consistent reference to the problems of party organization. When Gramsci first introduced pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will in 1920, and the Russian party had already displaced the mass intelligence of the councils. Gramsci's enthusiasm for the councils, alongside his insistence on the rigidity of the vanguard party, the latter coming increasingly to displace the former in his thinking between the defeats in Turin and the formation of the Communist Party, registered a dilemma that he would later revisit and clarify in his prison notebooks and his opaque-ass writing ways. But anyway, we'll come back here. What makes Gramsci so confounding to read and allows his writing to be so easily appropriated in irreconcilable ways is also a potentially source of great insight. Why could Togliatti and liberals use him? And why can Bordiga use him as a bête noire, even though Bordiga himself was sometimes on Gramsci's side? Not always. He critiques Gramsci pretty hard, but says, but doesn't seem to condemn him in the same way as he condemns some of the other factions. And also, apparently, they were friends when they were both in prison on the prison island, with some talk of Bordiga trying to help Gramsci get off the island, at least according to some historical sources I've read. I don't know what evidence we have for that. All right. To understand Gramsci's later deployment of the slogan, which we'll have to investigate the relevant concepts of the prison notebook informed by scholarship drawing on the critical edition, and to interpret whether theoretically and politically at state in Gramsci's evolving conceptions of pessimism and optimism, we have to examine the categories of intellect and will to which they are attached. Intellect. Okay, let's get into this. A recurring theme in Gramsci's prison notebooks is that all people are philosophers or intellectuals, even though the division of manual and intellectual labor in society makes it such that only a small group of people are recognized as being capable of thought. Take that, professional philosophers. For the Gramsci of the prison notebooks, as long as this division existed, the task of those who socially recognized as intellectuals would be to build a revolutionary culture and assume revolutionary leadership. Quote, there is no organization without intellectuals, that is, without organizers and leaders. In other words, without the theoretical aspect of the theory-practice nexus being distinguished completely by the existence of a group of people specialized in conceptual and philosophical elaboration of ideas. And yet, at the same time, the role of political organization was also to be able to cultivate mass intellectualities. This particular term, which appears to have been suspended between intelligence and intelligentsia in prevailing translations, throws the relation between the two into question. But despite its seeming obscurity, as Patagotis Soritis argues in a brilliant commentary, the notions of intellectuality refer to a very concrete questions referring to organization and its role in the transformation of the modes of thinking, in the confrontation with antagonistic ideologies, and in the articulation of learning practices. Gramsci is one of the few communist thinkers who's really concerned with pedagogy effectively. It refers us to the problems of the production of knowledge involved in the elaboration of strategies, but can be abused, as we've seen Gramsci often done. Gramsci's concept of mass intellectualities reframes the question of political leadership. To follow another line of his reasoning in the prison notebooks, the fact that there are leaders and led is an inescapable fact of politics, but the question is whether the leadership is oriented toward preserving the distinction for eternity or creating, quote, the conditions in which the division is no longer necessary. Are you trying to make everyone a possible leader or not? That is why, for Gramsci, for a mass of people who to be led to think coherently and in the same coherent fashion about the real present world is a philosophical event far more important and original than discovery of some philosophical genius of a truth which remains the property of a small group of intellectuals. We have to distinguish Gramsci's approach from the ideologies of so-called Western Marxism, which revolve around consciousness. This seems to be aimed at Lukács. As Bucky Gluckman points out, for these ideologies, the intellectual specific function is to give the working class the homogeneity, unity, and vision of the world. In contrast, Gramsci's, quote, refusal of a potential dissociation between the philosophical class consciousness and its real agent, the proletariat, rules out any problematic of the intellectuals that would transform them into depositories of class consciousness, as in the young Lukács, are guaranteers of the critique of the capitalist mode of production. This is why, she elaborates, for Gramsci, it is not, quote, the intellectuals who, as such, who enabled the subaltern class to become a leading and ruling class, a hegemonic class. Rather, this function is performed by the modern prince, the vanguard political party, as the basis from which the intellectual function has to be afresh, together with the relationship between research and politics and their reciprocal tension. Interesting. So Gramsci's basically arguing that the point of the intellectual was to abolish the need for there to be a separate caste of intellectuals. And if you're not doing that, and you're just thinking that you can dictate people towards arriving to their own consciousness, like, say, the young Lukács, you're actually hindering yourself and hindering the development of the proletariat. As Peter Thomas points out in his detailed and rigorous study of the prison notebooks, The Gramscian Moment, this book I have read, this was already what was at stake in the Benito Rosso. L'Ordre de Nouveau was a paradigmatic experiment of young intellectuals who sought to redefine their relationship with the working class in active pedagogical terms, a relationship in which they were more often the educated than the educator. In his 1930 reflection in prison on the touring experience, Gramsci responded to the accusations that the movement was spontaneous. He replied by insisting on, quote, the creativity and soundness of the leadership that the movement acquired. This was not an abstract leadership and, quote, did not consist in mechanical repetition of scientific or theoretical formulas. Crucially, quote, it did not confuse political action with theoretical disquisition. Rather, the leadership of the Tuareg movement, quote, devoted itself to real people and specific historical relations with specific sentiments, ways of life, fragments of worldviews, etc., that were the outcomes of spontaneous combinations of a given environment of material production with the fortuitous gathering of desperate social elements within the same environment. This spontaneity, Gramsci argued, was educated, it was given direction. The education and direction of the movement sought, quote, to unify it by means of modern theory, but to do so in a living, historically effective manner by the means of spontaneity of the movement. Its leadership emphasized the historical necessity character and, quote, gave the masses a theoretical consciousness of themselves as creators of historical and institutional values, as founders of states. Gramsci displaced the question of consciousness towards that of knowledge and its material constitution and the organizational forms. This was the originality of his reading of Lenin, which Bucky Gluckman emphasizes. He describes as gnosiological. Thomas contrasts this to epistemology, which would be the abstract problem of the production of knowledge. Gnosiology, as Gramsci uses it, refers more generally to effective reality, Wirklichkeit, of the human relations of knowledge. Gramsci's interpretation of Leninism in terms of the effective reality of human relations of knowledge structures his understanding of the politics of the intellect. At a methodological level, Gramsci scrutinized the classical Marxist claim that people acquire consciousness of structural conflicts on the level of ideologies. Is that a classical Marxist claim? This should be understood, he argued, as an affirmation of the gnosiological and not simply psychological and moral value. Lenin's greatest theoretical contribution to Marxism, quote, the theoretical practical principle of hegemony, had a gnosiological significance. Lenin, Gramsci wrote, advanced philosophy as philosophy insofar as he advanced political doctrine and practice. Theoria and praxis together again. He located knowledge in what Gramsci called the hegemonic apparatus, which, insofar as it creates ideological terrain, determines a reform of the consciousness and of the methods of knowledge. It is a fact of knowledge, a philosophical fact. By embedding knowledge in the concept of hegemonic apparatus, Blucky Gutman argues Gramsci clearly differentiated the theory of hegemony from the pure theory of consciousness or culture. He underscored its material reality as a complex center of institutions, ideologies, practices, and agents, including the intellectuals. This was not, however, the same thing as liberal study of static institutions, for hegemonic apparatus is intersected by the primacy of the class struggle. Elaborating on this point, Thomas adds that the class's hegemonic apparatus is a wide-ranging series of articulated institutions, understood in the broadest sense, and practices, from newspapers to educational organizations to political parties, by means of which a class and its allies engage their opponents in the struggle for political power. It is the specific relations of the force between classes, quote, the class's potential for political power therefore demands upon its ability to find institutional forms adequate to the differentia specifica of its own hegemonic project. The totality of Gramsci's work points us, in other words, to the problem of finding new organizational forms, political parties, which are historical experiments with new kinds of knowledge. In this regard, Sotiris underscores the Gramscian image of the party as a laboratory rather than the general staff of the proletarian army, which both contrast with Bordiga's party as the brain. Gramsci rather points us to a political process for the production of knowledge, strategies, tactics, and forms of intellectuality. intellectuality. This, from Gramsci's perspective, the party is not a predetermined structure which would subordinate various social movements to its authority. It is rather the name for the laboratory in which, as Sartorius puts it, a plurality of processes, practices, resistances, and collectivities can be unified into a common hegemonic project. I see why liberal professors are like this, because you can make this mean a lot of different things. A project which combines a new and original form of struggle, of resistance, blockage, reappropriation, and emancipation. This, quote, potential unification requires thinking the party are the organizations as a laboratory producing intellectualities, strategies, tactics, but also as a hegemonic practice. It is a constant encounter between practices, experiences, and knowledge. Let us bring this exegetical detour back to Gramsci's early statement of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. It should be clear that Gramsci was in fact grappling, albeit in a hasty and triumphalist manner, with the tension between the underlying recognition that all people are intellectuals and the condition of politics for which those with the social function of intellectuals play the leadership role. The continuity of these questions in Gramsci's evolving political thought form an essential context for the understanding of his deployment of pessimism and optimism in the prison notebooks, where it is most frequently encountered. Will. To understand the reappearance of the phrase in the prison notebooks, we turn theoretically from the intellect to the will, which is not only a key axis of the complex development of Gramsci's thought, but also a pillar of contemporary repetition of the slogan. Now, it seems the phrase is meant to discourage us from dreaming up utopias, downplaying defeats, or dismissing dangers. But we would not want to give the impression that this emphasis on the sobering pessimism leads us to quietism and surrender. Optimism of the will then becomes the necessary supplement for something that is missing in the original pessimism. It allows us to be comfortable with pessimism, to disseminate pessimism to those who cling to illusions because they would otherwise be incapable of coping with the hopelessness that pessimism brings. Cough, 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 cough. Not a theme here at all. But this abstract assessment of sentiments rather obscures what was at stake for Gramsci as he repeated the phrase in his prison notebooks, where it has represented a detailed and systemic reflection on the strategic and organizational question of his revolutionary experience. The historical background has drastically changed. By 1926, revolutionary politics in Italy had been defeated and fascism had consolidated his rule. In his prison notebooks, Gramsci was dealing with politics anew. As Bucky Gluckman puts it, after the failures of the revolution, the consolidation of the dictatorship, new strength can only come from knowledge. It was probably one footnote in the standard English volume selected from the prison notebooks which popularized the slogan among the Anglophone readers in 1971. The context was a discussion of the history of the Italian politics and political thought written from 1930 to 1932, in which Gramsci was reflecting on the effectiveness of political will, which has, quote, turned to awakening new and original forces rather than merely circulating on the traditional ones. His inspiration was Machiavelli, whose fundamental recognition that politics is an autonomous activity provided a necessary supplement to Marxism, which in the conditions of defeat had a tendency to lapse into mechanistic economic determinism. It also does that in conditions of victory sometimes, but we'll come back to that later, maybe. In its belief in the inevitable and predetermined coming of the revolutionary conditions, this determinism resembled nothing more than a religious fatalism. I often accuse communizers of this because they seem to think that while there's a voluntaristic element of like organizing communism through participation in riots and stuff, that history had already sucked out any other revolutionary subjectivity. And thus we just have to wait for the crisis to force us to start conditioning people towards communism. We'll read some communization theory eventually on the channel because I have a lot of issues with it. For Gramsci, what was important about Machiavelli was his realization that the historical transformations announced by the Renaissance could not be achieved without the formation of a national state, and some historical agent was required which would represent the collective will and achieve this historical task, the prince. But the prince was not an already existing person. In writing The Prince, Machiavelli was trying to call this agent into being. He thus bridged between preceding tendencies of political thought to either dreams of utopia or engage in a disinterested scholarly analysis. So Machiavelli's concrete will to bring about a new order could not be reduced to utopias and daydreams, as skeptics like his aristocratic associate Guarcardini had charged. The skeptical attitude, which dismissed any possibility for historical change, had to be distinguished, Gramsci wrote, from a real pessimism of the intelligence, which can be combined with optimism of the will and the active and realistic politicians. At this point, the editors and translators of the selections from the prison notebook added a footnote referring to another portion of the notebook from 1932, an independent fragment on daydreams and fantasies. Gramsci wrote that daydreams and fantasies were fundamentally passive, imagining that, quote, something has happened to upset the mechanism of necessity, and therefore one's own initiative has become free. As a political orientation, this was a stark contrast to Machiavelli's concrete will, which applied itself, he wrote elsewhere, to the effective reality and aimed at the creation of new equilibrium amongst the forces which really exist and are operative. Here he repeated the decisive phrase, on the contrary, it is necessary to direct one's attention violently towards the present as it is, if one wishes to transform it. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. This is the focus here. You have to realize where you're at, not where you hope to be, to actually change anything. Anyway, back to this. The language is striking, yet incomprehensible without the understanding the way Gramsci was using Machiavelli to elaborate on the problems of revolutionary strategy that had preoccupied him before prison. Machiavelli, embedded in his particular historical moment, represented the formation of a concrete will in terms of the qualities, characteristics, duties, and requirements of a concrete individual. For Gramsci, quote, the modern prince, which had the historic task of bringing about the alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry that would be capable of initiating the process of the transition to the working state, based off of what Lenin had done. And there's still enough peasantry in Italy at the time that this wasn't nonsense. Could not be a real person, a concrete individual. Rather, it had to be a complex element of society in which collective will, which had already been reorganized and has to some extent asserted itself in action, began to take concrete form. History has already provided this organism, and it is a political party. The first cell, which there had come together, the germ of a collective will, tending to become universal and total. For Gramsci, the pessimism of the intellect constituted the refusal to conceive of politics in terms of ahistorical dreams of utopias. This does not mean simply resigning oneself to the equilibrium of effective reality. Optimism of the will was the application of the autonomy of politics to be really existing and operative forces which could bring about a new equilibrium. But this was not simply a matter of individual determination. It was nothing other than the party whose organizational processes brought about the formulation of a concrete and collective will, the ability of a class to think for itself, as opposed to just be in itself. As Sotiris writes, Gramsci's reflection on Machiavelli, quote, encapsulates the necessity of the political party in opposition to the other forms of organization, exactly on the basis of a need not only to form a collective will, but also to enable it to articulate and execute a political project. Quote, just as Machiavelli, quote, sought the person that could function as a catalyst for the process of national unification of the fragmented Italian space and a modern political party, Gramsci believed that the Communist Party should also function in a unifying way, articulating the fragmented and molecular practices and aspirations of the subaltern and a common political demand for radical transformation. Thus, Gramsci treated the Communist Party as, quote, the terrain par excellence for the elaboration of a collective will capable of being the protagonist of a process of social transformation. But as Thomas points out, where Gramsci saw the political party as, quote, the historical given form in which the decisive element of organization, unification, and coordination had already begun to occur, the re-elaboration of this form into a non-bureaucratic instrument of proletarian hegemony would require an ongoing dialectical exchange with popular initiatives from which the modern prince could emerge and into which it would seek to intervene. Let us then recall these reflections on the possibility of organizations which were taking place under the conditions of defeat. It is in this context that Gramsci brought the strategic and organizational question of the party towards the problem of politics as an autonomous activity. As Thomas writes, quote, the modern prince for Gramsci, imprisoned for being a member of the Communist Party, was a collective body constituted as an active social relation of knowledge and organization, which could initiate the formation of a collective will, social imaginary. But just as its Machiavellian predecessor, Gramsci's Modern Prince remained no more than a proposal for the future and not a concrete reality. In his time are our own. In this very concrete sense, Gramsci is our contemporary. What we miss in reducing pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will to the sensibility is practical importance of Gramsci's reflection. In absence of an organizational form which can operate as the organizer of a concrete and collective will, politics has been unavailable to us. To recall Gramsci's formulation, we require theories of practices and organization which are oriented towards awakening new and original forces rather than circulating on the traditional ones. Oh my God, do we like circulating on the traditional ones? Ethics. We cannot entirely separate the organizational question of politics as an autonomous activity, which runs continuously from L'Ordine Nouveau to the prison notebooks, from what we might call the ethical disposition of those who participate in politics. However, the problem of ethics should be distinguished from the psychological and moral level, which is also the level of consciousness, that Gramsci clearly demarcated from the gnosiological. Gramsci's writings propose a new ethical principle, each marked by a fundamental line of demarcation, which begins in passages that were not included in the initial English translation, but made available in the larger edition edited by Pete Buttigieg's father, Joseph, and in his letters. Oh, we still don't have all the fucking prison notebooks, but anyway. In a portion of the longer passages from 1929 to 1930, Gramsci wrote that Marxist catastrophism was a valid reaction to the general optimism of the 19th century. Quote, Marx poured cold water over the enthusiasm with his law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Gramsci criticized the optimistic tendency to imagine utopias, which led people to fantasize about an easy solution to every problem, something that we still deal with today, even in moments of despair. All the most ridiculous daydreamers, he wrote, descended upon the new movement to propagate their tales of a hitherto unrecognized genius, thereby casting discredit on them. Instead, he said, it is necessary to create a sober, patient people who do not despair in the face of the worst horrors and who do not become exuberant with every silliness. Pessimism of the intelligence, optimism of the will. In another independent fragment in the notebooks from 1932, Optimism and Pessimism, he noted that optimism is nothing more than the defense of one's laziness. One's responsibility, the will to do nothing. I feel that way about all the crisis theory stuff too. Crisis theory may be real or not, and it may be a good check on infinite optimism, but if you think it's just going to bring about revolution for you or any sort of political change for you automatically, you're being lazy and you're rendering it to the form of eschatology. Anyway, back to text. And it is therefore also a form of fatalism and mechanicism. Bernstein and the immiserationist are actually committing the same mistake. Bernstein's evolutionary optimism, the Masonist optimism that the worst will make people fight for the better, both of which seem to be overly hopeful. Optimism means relying on factors extraneous to one's will and activity. What is necessary instead was a reaction which took, quote, the intelligence for its point of departure. Gramsci rejected the enthusiasm resulting from the exaltation of factors extraneous from one's will and activity, which is nothing more than the external adoration of fetishes. And yet, there is also a justifiable enthusiasm, which could only be that, quote, which accomplishes the intelligent will, the intelligent activity, the invective richness of concrete initiatives which change existing reality. We cannot avoid noticing the binary opposition of the slogan has been displaced. Cough. There is an optimism tied to the will to do nothing, which is contrasted to an intelligent will. A certain kind of optimism of the will, then, is not only a counterpart of fatalism and mechanicism, but also a form of utopian dreaming. This is not simple because pessimism is needed to correct the optimism of the will. The alternative Gramsci actually describes instead is a fusion of intelligence and will, an intelligent will, which is accompanied by a justifiable form of enthusiasm. With this, he recalls the slogan printed in the box under the title from the very first issue of L'Ordine Nouveau, educate yourself because we all need all your intelligence. Rouse yourself because we all need all your enthusiasm. Organize yourself because we all need all of your strength. Enthusiasm is the first new ethical principle. I always find it funny that I've actually been saying stuff like this, even in the period where I hated Gramsci, because I've always been like, you're responsible for what you use. You're responsible for educating yourself, and you need to be better, not a victim. All right. A victim just waiting for things to be fixed by the outsider, dependence on the state, or by someone else renders you not useful to us. Whereas if you educate yourself, because we all need it, you are rousing yourself to be more likely to be part of a useful subject. In a 1929 letter to his brother Carlo, in which he recalled the experience that both his brothers had been in conditions of war, Gramsci reflected on the hardship and deprivation and rejected those vulgar Boehner states of mind which are called pessimism and optimism. His state of mind, Gramsci said, synthesizes these two emotions and overcomes them. I'm a pessimist because of intelligence, but I'm an optimist because of will. He claimed that in all circumstances, he thought first of the worst possibility in order to set a moment all the reserves of my will and to be in a position to knock down the obstacle. And at the same time, he said, I have never entertained any illusions and I have never suffered any disappointments. But he did not end by reiterating the slogan. He shifted instead to different words. I have always taken care to arm myself with unlimited patience, not passive, inert, but animated by perseverance. Interesting. Not how that phrase is normally understood, is it? Perhaps between the prison notebooks and this letter, the Gnoseological level and the psychological and moral level appear to be conflated. Here, Gramsci does not appear to be speaking of knowledge which is embedded in a hegemonic apparatus, the organizational labor of the formation of the concrete and collective will, yet these letters cannot be reduced to a mere indication of Gramsci's psychological and moral state. His personal situation is precisely the historical and political condition of defeat he set out to theorize, defined by the political void that no modern prince was available to fill. If we rush quickly to conflate the psychological and moral with the gnoseological, we run the risk of abstracting the personal will, in which Gramsci criticizes in his notes on daydreams, by detaching it from the organizational process that can actually form a concrete and collective will. Despite beginning with the oppositions between pessimism and optimism, intellect and will, in this letter, Gramsci in fact redirects them towards perseverance, a unitary category which is tied not to optimism or pessimism, but to patience. In a certain form, Gramsci wrote in 1930 to 1932 note, perseverance is enabled by the mechanistic philosophy of history. Quote, for those who do not have the initiative in struggle and for whom, therefore, the struggle ends up only being synonymous with a series of defeats, that's most of you guys and me, really, mechanical determinism becomes a formidable force of moral resistance, of cohesion, and of patient perseverance. It allows one to say, I am defeated, but in the long run, history is on my side. In other words, this kind of perseverance is an act of faith in the rationality of history transmuted into an impassioned teleology that is a substitute for predestination, providence, etc. of religion. However, Gramsci argued that despite this belief in mechanical determinism, in reality, the will is active. It intervenes directly in the force of circumstances, albeit in a more covert and veiled manner. When those who are accustomed to being defeated become historical protagonists, quote, the mechanistic conception will sooner or later represent an imminent danger and will be the revision of a whole mode of thinking because of the existence will have changed. That's smart. Revising the note in 1932-33, Gramsci emphasized it was never really the case that the subaltern was inactive. In fact, fatalism is nothing other than clothing worn by real and active will when it is in a weak position. Aha! So when I'm being fatalistic, I'm still not being fatalistic. Thank you, Gramsci. No. This is why it was necessary to, quote, demonstrate the futility of mechanical determinism, which as a naive philosophy of the mass could be, quote, an intrinsic element of strength, but it would, if adopted as a thought-out and coherent philosophy on the part of intellectuals, become a cause of passivity, of idiotic self-sufficiency. And I've definitely seen that. This happens when intellectuals, quote, don't even expect the subaltern will become directive and responsible, but in fact, some part of even the subaltern mass is always directive and responsible. Hence, perseverance cannot be a political principle if it's attached to a future prophecy. Hence my railing against eschatology all the time, if you guys are wondering why I do that. but rather embodies the patient capacity to recognize the active will that persists beyond one's personal psychological and moral state. It requires patience, but also courage. That's why I don't just give up on you fuckers. In 1930 to 1932, notebook entry on militancy and political craft, Gramsci observed that staying for a long time in the trenches requires courage, that is, perseverance and boldness, which can be produced either by terror, certain death if one does not stay, or by the conviction that it is necessary, courage. Perseverance is a second new ethical principle, so enthusiasm and perseverance. Ironically, those are two virtues that are talked a lot about in my religious tradition. But anyway, perseverance is irreducible to the level of the individual because it is at this level, as Gramsci was ultimately forced to conclude, that the dialectic of pessimism and optimism breaks down. In a letter to his sister-in-law, Tatiana Such, in 1933, months after Hitler's appointment to the Chancellor of Germany, Gramsci revisited this slogan. Until a while ago, he wrote, I was able, so to speak, pessimistic in my intelligence and optimist in my will, but he could no longer sustain the synthesis of pessimism and optimism. Today, I no longer think in this way. This does not mean I've decided to surrender, so to speak, but it means that I no longer see any concrete way out, and I can no longer count any reserve of strength to expend that I can draw on. His body failing him, he saw no escape from his prison cell. Without an organized collective body to sustain it, the individual body falters. Alienation affects your intelligence, peeps, even though it is a human constant. For those of you who say that, I agree. But like salt is a human constant, you need a little bit of it. Alienation, how you recognize others. But if you drill in it constantly, and when it becomes your dominant thing, it'll kill you, just like eating way too much salt. When the political conditions of the party can no longer be taken for granted, or any other collective institution for that matter, and the optimism of the will has become a daydream, pessimism of the intellect does not yield knowledge. We are required instead to preserve in the interregnum between the previous moments of emancipatory possibility and the unachieved discovery of a new concrete hegemonic political form. Both perseverance and enthusiasm have to be separated from mechanicism and fatalism and refer instead to the concrete will that applies itself to effective reality. Hear, hear. And in order to do so, they must be based in the collective body and not the individual consciousness. As psychological and moral categories, pessimism, the intellect, optimism, the real, one's counter to the ethical disposition articulated in the margins of Gramsci's text. Pessimism of the intellect confirms itself to the experience of defeat, severing the personal body from the collective body, which is required for us to persevere. You're not going to survive by yourself. Preserving in politics is difficult and requires a patient and courageous commitment, which does not depend on the forecast of the future or whatever fucking fads you're fucking following on Twitter. Sorry. Optimism of the will obscures the problem of organizational forms and forecloses their enthusiastic investigation. It means clinging to traditional forces rather than creating and organizing new ones. And if you don't see that today, you see everybody trying to replay out 1917, 1914, 1951, 1941, 1969, 1968. Yeah, you don't live in those contexts, motherfuckers. That is not available to you. Rather than creating and organizing new ones, even if they fail, because each failure does teach us something. See Occupy and BLM and the party and the DSA and tailing of all variety. Anyway, and thus incompatible with the intelligent will, which is defined by enthusiasm for concrete initiatives which can change the existing reality. Enthusiasm and perseverance emerge as Gramsci's ethical principles, and they only ethically work if you're a virtue ethicist, which is part of why I am one, by the way. Haider isn't going into that, but it's in this. But now it is time to conclude by revisiting pessimism and optimism. Reversal. Haha. I believe that our current moment shows us that Gramsci's insights are not well represented by the slogan, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And in fact, we will better understand our situation if we precisely reverse it. Yes. Yes. Optimism of the intellect, because we have to start by recognizing that all people are capable of thought. They are not the only forms of conception of the world, but also experiments with new possibilities. I don't think the masses are stupid, and anyone who does is actually probably undermining their own expertise. The masses may act stupidly or behave stupid to the conditions of which their life, which are absurd. But humans survive because we are relatively adaptable on some fundamental level that may not be articulatable in traditional educational ways. I really do believe this, by the way. But that doesn't mean I'm not a pessimist. I absolutely am. I'm just not a misanthropist. And this is why. There are no emancipatory politics without recognizing the universal capacity for thought. If you don't believe people can do it, why the fuck are you here? Unless you're just trying to use us to form some new technocratic whatever. In which case, we should rightly turn against you. Gramsci never failed to emphasize the two essential points, that all people are philosophers and that this mass intelligence is the basis for a future society. And that despite the political division between leaders and the led, rulers and the ruled, it is possible to engage in forms of political action which abolish this distinction rather than preserving it. It is quite distinct from the optimism about the future regarding over which we must pass in silence. We don't know the future. It could get better, it could get worse. You have no fucking idea. Although indications are right now, it's probably going to get worse. Or optimism of the intellect is one which says it is possible for people to govern themselves, and every act of collective resistance, this capacity is confirmed. But pessimism of the will, because we know that the will has to take a material organizational form, and that across the history of revolutionary politics, the classical form assumed by the young Gramsci is no longer available to us. We lack the concrete basis for organizations in the model of 20th century revolutions, and we like their mode of production too, at least in the way that existed then. We know from history, which followed, that these revolutions, that the emancipatory participation of the party seizing the state has been exhausted. Gramsci never abandoned the insight of Lenin that politics develop under conditions and the political will must take that organizational form. He deepened this line of thought for a situation of defeat in which the organization of wills was not available. He was not afraid to grapple with the problem of the conquest of political power, which still remains with us, but could not have incorporated into his analysis the exhaustion of the party state and the enclosure of its emancipatory horizon, which frames our present. Which is why you guys are always finding some subjects outside of yourselves, because it means you don't have to do anything. Anyway, and thus you don't have to think of new organizational forms and new ways to get to those organizations. And even if you think we need a party and we need a dictatorship of the proletariat and control the state to even undo the state, that even if you still think that, you have to come up with a means to bring it about. And most of the way people try to do it repeats the old sectarian formations, which we've seen fail over and over and over and over and over and over and over again in the developed world, and also not take off in the ways predicted in the developing world. While national liberation does create people as concurrent units, we don't often see them pivot to the other parts that we expect them to pivot, do we? So, back to Haider, we are still faced with the necessity of politics as an autonomous activity, the formation of concrete and collective wills, but it must take a material form which is adequate to the present. Even a party would be different from the party of 1917. Sorry. What we need now is not a voluntary dedication to repeating old models, which inevitably end up being weird dramatic sex, but laboratories in which you can observe new forces and experiment with new forms. Take the stuff around the 10-inch unit, for example, which has lots of limitations. I'm not saying it doesn't. Our subjective horizon is the optimism of the intellect. Our objective structuring condition is pessimism of the will. Without the optimism of the intellect, we have a party without the people, which is what a lot of people have. They don't want people messing with their pristine ideological conditions. They want to impose it. Without pessimism of the will, we have an illusion of power. Until we recognize this, there is no path for action. And illusions of power, I'm going to add, have dominated the left for the past 15 years. Whereas the liberal left, thinking that the social power it can manifest over tech oligarchies would stay in their control because they were fucking stupid, or whether it was the socialist left pretending that Bernie was some radical change to the system and that their Bonapartist delusions couldn't be easily undermined, are recuperated. And that's not even getting to all the other weird shit that emerged in Occupy and BLM and the riots, etc. All right. Appendix. Where's the Socialist Party going? The following unsigned editorial appeared at Gramsci, appeared in La Vie Nouveau on January 10th, 1920. And I'll just read it. This is Gramsci's action. The direct action of the masses can only be imminently destructive. If the masses take up the slogan which leads them to exercise of control over the public and private activity of the capitalist class, their action can only culminate in complete destruction of the state machine. The proletariat took up the slogan, it is necessary to control traffic to stop arms and munitions intended for the enemies of the Russian Revolution, to stop goods determined for Hungary, of the land of magnates, to prevent the movement of troops intended to reactivate the war in the Balkans and in all of Europe. It was inevitable this would lead all the way to the events of Ancona, the armed insurrection. The direct action of the working masses is revolutionary precisely because it is eminently destructive. Since the working class has no power over the industrial government, it is natural that it reveals the acquired economic power intending towards destroying industrial discipline and all industrial discipline, since the working class occupies the same position in the army as it does in the factory, since in the factory, just as in the army, the working class must submit to discipline and law that has not been contributing to establishing. It is natural that it would tend towards destroying the discipline of the army and destroying it completely. It's also why that you've seen less and less conscript armies in the world, because it means that public sentiment actually matters more. Since the whole bourgeois state apparatus is completely extraneous and hostile to the proletarian masses, it is natural that every revolutionary action is directly controlled governmental activity would ultimately lead to the complete destruction of the bourgeois state apparatus to arm insurrection. The communists were persuaded that this must happen, that it could not happen any other way. Therefore, the communists are not afraid of direct action of the masses and the inevitable destruction that might come with it, or that comes with it. One is afraid of the unpredictable and unexpected, not of what is expected as a necessity in which one tries to advance. Which we try to advance is to be able to dominate the reality which is expected to arise and to assure the destruction already consciously contains the elements and will for reconstruction, to assume that the violence is not sterile outburst of blind fury, but economic and political power that liberates itself and sets the conditions for its own development. The slogan of the government activity led to the railroad strikes, to the general strikes resulting from the railroad strikes leading to the insurrections of Ancona. Since the General Confederation of Labor, the acting secretary, has an English gardener's conception of the workers' control, and since the General Confederation of Labor wants a well-behaved control, which respects liberty, order, and democracy, the Confederation immediately issued the circular, for Hungary and for Russia, we can only do what we can and not what we might want. It seems to us that the derailing of every rail car, in addition to being practically difficult, would bring consequences and complications. Your actions must therefore be limited to what is possible, that everything is possible while avoiding complications. The economy precedes politics. Since the reformists and opportunists have the whole mechanism of the Italian labor movement in their hand, the reformists and opportunists have the power of the Socialist Party in their hands. Imposing, directing, and tactics in the party, the action of the party has collapsed. The mass movement has served the parliamentary group, allowed it to reap victory after victory. They have served to allow the reformist disputes to consolidate a position and to make easier and therefore more laden with laurels a rise to governmental power. So what happens to the practical incapacity of the components of leadership, that the everyday Italian Socialist Party loses more of its strength and organizational power over the masses. So what happens to the anarchist Congress of Bologna had such importance for the proletarian masses, and so it will happen if the communist groups do not react energetically. The party will end up losing control over the masses, and the latter, having no guide, will, in an unfolding crisis of events, be driven to a situation worse than the masses of Austria and Germany. We of La Vie Nouveau and of the Turin socialists in general will present presented to the Italian proletariat, and after the April movement, as a fanatical, agitated, and undisciplined rabble. Since the leaders of the central offices do not concern themselves with what happens amongst the industrialists and what happened amongst the workers, because they see history as unfolding through the operation of ideological extraction, classes in general, parties in general, humanity in general, I definitely see that a lot, and not through the action of real men who are named Peter, Paul, and John, and are what they really are, and not through the actions of determinate urban and rural communities in space and time, which change and change rapidly in the current period. With the changing of places and passing of months and even weeks, these leaders foresaw none of this and ended up the tail of the devil in every event, and end up unloading their historical responsibility onto the shoulders of multiplying undisciplined and anarchoid groups. Meanwhile, the Turin Socialist section has the merit of formulating an action to take control of the union movement away from the reformists, predicting, easy prediction, that in the final moment, the union bosses would have sabotaged the will of the party and of the masses. This action did not have the results that it should have had because of the very intervention of the party leadership. The Turin section, accused of indiscipline around the April movement, had already before the movement prepared the National Council, in which it harshly condemned the leadership for not having devoted any concern to revolutionary organization and to the establishment of a strongly centralized and responsible discipline. Unfortunately, the report of the Turin section is still relevant. The latest events are aggravated by the repetition of the April events in Turin. It has become more and more relevant than we could have believed, including this paragraph. The political party of the working class justifies the existence only to the extent that the powerfully centralized and coordinating proletarian action it contraposes a de facto revolutionary power to the legal power of the bourgeois state and limits its freedom of initiative and maneuver. If the party fails to unify and coordinate its efforts, it reveals it simply as a bureaucratic institution with no soul or will, and the working class will instinctively move from another party and shift its alliance to the anarchist tendencies, the very ones that bitterly and ceaselessly criticize the centralization and bureaucracy of political parties. The party lacks the organization and propaganda for revolutionary organization, which corresponds to the configuration of the proletarian masses to the factories and the barracks and the offices, and it's capable of training the masses with a very revolutionary leap. The party, insofar that it does not seek to fuse vitally with the proletarian masses, continues to conserve in its assemblies, which meet only occasionally and cannot effectively control the action of the union bosses, the figure of a merely parliamentary party. That's important to those of you who think you can work with Democrats, which is afraid of direct action because of unforeseen events, which is forced to take more steps backward every day and permit the rebirth of the most populist and frenzied reformists and the most foolish collaboration as propaganda. I feel like I see that all the time. An enormous effort must be made by the communist groups and the Socialist Party, which is what it is in the final analysis, because Italy is a wholly economically backwards country. The slogan, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, must become the slogan of every communist conscious efforts and sacrifices that are demand for those who voluntarily assume the post of the militant in the ranks of the working class. Pessimism of the will. It means quit trying to use the optimism of the will to bring back what has already been lost and actually forge on to something new. A political party won't look like the political party of the day, even if you think that is the answer, and I agree with you, eventually it is the answer. It is not just magically repeating the tools of the past or bringing it out of the same conditions. You have no peasants to form an allegiance with. Most of your workers are not industrial workers in highly unionized sectors and highly formal fields. The old strategies of reformism are of these quasi-militarized groups are not available to you. Most of you have never known military service, either individual or in any capacity. And you are afraid of it. In some ways, rightly. You must be willing to look at the darkness and failure of the last 20 years and of the last century first. Then you can come up with an alternative to tailing every fucking thing that comes up to you, following every fad, being a useful idiot for everybody, and even conflicting movements. And until such time, we have a right to be pessimistic. Protect your peace. You'll need it. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, and keep learning. Because educate yourself, because we need you all to add to our collective intelligence. And most people are finding that harder and harder to do. Good day.